Nothing? The ultra-liberal Contrarian take on Joe Biden's legacy. If a recent poll is to be believed, the most common word Americans associate with President Joe Biden's legacy is nothing. According to the survey, a majority of voters cannot name a single Biden accomplishment. Conservative media outlets, predictably, have pounced on this as evidence of Biden's supposed failure. But as an ultra-liberal Contrarian, I argue that the Biden presidency has been far from nothing. Rather, it has been a paradox, both revolutionary and disappointing, simultaneously impactful and inadequate. The real issue isn't Biden's supposed lack of action, but the failure of American political discourse to recognize how our system dilutes, co-opts, and buries progressive change. The myth of nothing. To say that Joe Biden's presidency amounts to nothing is a privileged, myopic, and fundamentally dishonest take. If the public perceives Biden's tenure as an empty void, that says more about our collective attention span, the way corporate media frames political achievements, and the structural inefficiencies of American governance than it does about Biden himself. Let's start with the basics. The Biden administration delivered the most significant infrastructure investment in generations, a $1.2 trillion package designed to modernize roads, bridges, water systems, and broadband networks. This wasn't just a legislative victory, it was a blueprint for sustainable economic growth. And yet, because infrastructure isn't as sexy as tax cuts or wars, it gets dismissed as nothing. Similarly, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act marked the most aggressive action the U.S. government has ever taken on climate change. This legislation secured $369 billion for clean energy initiatives, transitioning America toward a decarbonized economy. Climate change, an existential threat, has been met with tangible policy interventions. Is that truly nothing? And then there's the economy. Under Biden, unemployment plummeted to record lows, wages rose, and the U.S. saw an economic recovery that outpaced much of the world post-pandemic. Inflation? Yes, it surged, largely due to corporate price gouging and global supply chain disruptions, but it also moderated. Instead of recognizing these nuances, critics reduce economic discourse to a cheap soundbite: Bidenflation. Why Biden's achievements are dismissed. If Biden has accomplishments, why can't most Americans name them? The answer lies in two primary issues: the failure of democratic messaging and the conservative stranglehold on public discourse. Biden, ever the institutionalist, has remained beholden to a bygone era where bipartisanship and compromise meant something. Instead of hammering home his victories with the relentless, aggressive messaging strategy that Republicans have perfected, he assumes that legislative wins will speak for themselves. They don't. The modern political landscape demands constant, bombastic reinforcement of one's narrative. Democrats, perennially allergic to such tactics, allow their successes to be buried under the latest media-manufactured outrage cycle. Meanwhile, right-wing media outlets have turned Biden's tenure into a dystopian spectacle. Fox News, Breitbart, and their ilk portray his presidency as an unmitigated disaster, amplifying every stumble, slurring speech, and cognitive lapse while ignoring policy achievements. They've rebranded Biden as an incompetent, doddering old man, not the leader who steered the U.S. through a once-in-a-century pandemic and economic crisis. The result? A perception that his presidency is meaningless, even as its effects reshape the country. The failure of incrementalism. Now, as much as I push back against the nothing narrative, I also recognize the frustration at the heart of it. Many Americans, especially progressives, expected more. Biden promised a return to normalcy, but normalcy itself is a problem. We live in an era of escalating crises: climate catastrophe, wealth inequality, corporate dominance, and the erosion of democracy. Biden's approach, an old-school, incrementalist, play-it-safe centrism, feels insufficient for the moment. Take student debt relief. Biden's executive action to forgive billions in student loans was a step in the right direction, yet it was immediately kneecapped by the Supreme Court. Rather than finding a more aggressive workaround, his administration has largely accepted defeat, leaving millions burdened by predatory debt. On healthcare, Biden championed an expansion of the Affordable Care Act but shied away from the transformational vision of Medicare for all. The result? Millions remain underinsured, pharmaceutical companies continue their extortionist pricing, and America's healthcare crisis festers. Immigration? While Republicans decry Biden's border crisis, the truth is his policies have largely mirrored those of previous administrations, tougher than progressives want, yet nowhere near the draconian cruelty of Trumpism. Instead of systemic reform, we get half measures that satisfy no one. The contrarian conclusion: Biden's legacy is everything and nothing. So, is Biden's legacy nothing? Far from it. His presidency has been consequential, but its impact is either diluted, unrecognized, or insufficient in the face of the crises we face. The real failure is not inaction but the inability to communicate, consolidate, and radicalize the change that has been set in motion. Biden's term exemplifies the contradictions of American politics: a system designed to resist transformation, a media ecosystem that distorts reality, and an electorate conditioned to expect spectacle rather than governance. His presidency is not a void, it is a mirror, reflecting both the successes and limitations of the Democratic establishment. The real question isn't whether Biden has done nothing. It's whether the system will ever allow any president to do enough. If Biden's legacy appears hollow, it's because the American political machine ensures that all but the most extreme figures, whether reactionary demagogues or radical visionaries, get sanded down into palatable, forgettable centrism. That is the true crisis, and until we address it, every president's legacy will feel like nothing at all.